Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host, with another marvelous video. Dr. Church was little less than a criminally insane person. He considered himself to be something of a superior human being and wanted to create a new form of human in his own image, and wanted these superior humans to have a hive mind like the xenomorphs at the center of it. Unlike the run-of-the-mill crazy scientists, Church's demeanor was incredibly eccentric, something that allowed him to mask his cold, dark, and ruthless ideologies about humans and the value of human life. In this video, we'll explore the evil Dr. Paul Church, who performed the most gruesome of experiments on his own staff aboard a spaceship named the Innominata. Get ready for a deep dive into the 4 issues of Alien's Labyrinth, a comic that's a must-read for all Alien fans. Let's begin. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The Innominata. When Colonel Dr. Lennox dies under mysterious circumstances on Innominata, a deep space military research space station, Colonel Dr. Tony Crespi is sent to the spaceship as a substitute for Lennox. In reality, Crespi's mission is to secretly investigate the foul rumors concerning the modus operandi of Innominata's head researcher, Dr. Paul Church. Furthermore, Crespi has full authority and discretion to forcefully take emergency command of Innominata if necessary. Crespi is ready to set foot on the research vessel. We get a better picture of the rumors concerning Innominata when Crespi's junior requests him to debunk a few stories. He says, "Well, sir, we've heard that crew members there are considered expendable and used in clandestine experiments." However, Crespi asks his men not to pay heed to stories that do not have any basis. Nevertheless, Crespi is joined by Lieutenant McGinnis on his mission aboard the Innominata. Crespi is summoned by his superior on the ship, Admiral Thaves, who welcomes him on the research vessel. But there seems to be something off and fishy about Thaves. Like, he's just the kind of guy that you don't quite trust immediately. We think that writers have done a tremendous job here, trying to create extremely humane and believable characters. Moving on, when Crespi asks if he'd be working with Dr. Church, the Admiral does not give a definitive answer. Crespi makes several requests to be allowed to meet Church, but Thaves denies all. He says, "I'm sorry to have to inform you that Church has determined that he does not need a new second in command." It was not until Crespi threatened to petition a superseding authority that Thaves agreed to talk to Church about Crespi. Until now, it seems that although Thaves is in charge of the ship, Church is the de facto leader, and everyone serves him and his purposes. While waiting in his assigned chamber, Crespi is informed that Church is ready to see him. Dr. Church was a thin old man with white hair and blue eyes. There was not anything outrightly sinister about him, but his eyes told a different story altogether. Church reiterated the story that Thaves had already told Crespi. The evil doctor said about Dr. Lennox, if he hadn't died when he did, he would have been transferred. Nothing for him to do here. Nothing for you to do here, either. Church tells Crespi that his research has been downsized and there's not much to keep him engaged. But Crespi demands an explanation for Lennox's bizarre death. It turns out that his brain had been pushed out the back of his head, a claim that Church termed as macabre. But Crespi was relentless, and Church said something to Crespi that was equal parts a warning and a threat. "You're out of your league, Crespi. Your superiors have tossed you into the Innominata like cavemen throwing a dog into a pond to fetch their reflections." Realizing that Crespi was a headstrong man, Church resorted to showing Crespi his setup. The two of them reached a giant pit with all kinds of weapons pointing down below. Crespi was shocked to find a xenomorph inside the pit. It turns out that the 30 feet deep pit had a force field above it. The walls of the pit were made of solid acid-neutralizing alloy. Also, there were motion-sensitive electrodes, and if the xenomorph tried to jump out of its captivity, the electrodes would fire up, which would not only electrocute the creature, but also roast it alive. To demonstrate what his setup could do, Church shocks the xenomorph and explains that periodic electric shocks were necessary to keep a captive xenomorph from going dormant. Apparently, Church's research has shown that the xenomorphs do not live long in captivity. However, we've noticed in various other sources that xenomorph queens have managed to stay alive for hundreds of years in captivity and isolation. Nevertheless, Tony reveals that he'd encountered a horde of xenomorphs himself some 9 years ago. Actually, this is from the plot of another comic book titled Aliens Backsplash. Church then takes Crespi to witness another leg of his experiments. He puts a man in automatic sensors and puts him in the xenocage, where he also puts a pig to serve as the alien's food. However, instead of eating the food, the starving xenomorph attacked the armed man. Church explains they do not consider themselves as individuals. They fight for their species, not themselves. They cannot be frightened, intimidated, or bribed into not attacking. Pain, Fatigue, overwhelming odds. Nothing mitigates their aggression. The electrodes activated as soon as the man was attacked, but all they could do was knock the alien down momentarily. Church then puts the alien to another test where it was made to choose between escaping and devouring the pig. The beast chose the latter, and Church opined that xenomorphs are probably aware of how afraid their victim is, and this fear is directly proportional to the mess created by the xenomorph while killing the poor soul. Lastly, Church sent in 2 unarmed men to face the xenomorph, and one of them had been given a dose of a substance called FITR, a telepathine that induced a sense of invulnerability and increased mental strength. The xenomorph attacked the sober man, who was scared beyond measure. However, just before slashing the man, the alien stopped. It was as if it had changed its mind. Church's conclusion was that the alien was able to psychically see the mind of the other man, whose will caused the creature to pause the attack. It is often human nature to play God and control the forces of nature, and that's what Church was up to. He wanted to use synthetic E-waves to reduce nature's apex killing machine to a fawning puppy and entire hives into petting zoos. But Church had to halt the proud description of his crazy plans when he was informed that one of the xenomorphs had escaped captivity. He ordered his men to secure the floor, get reinforcements, and asked for a head count. Everyone was accounted for except one man, Lieutenant Mortensen. They did all they could, but Mortensen could not be saved. The xenomorph sneaked up to him and impaled his skull. The death sent shockwaves across the ship, and Crespi was asked to stay in his chamber until the threat had been contained. Once there, Lieutenant McGinnis came to meet Crespi. She tells him that according to her preliminary inquiry, the tracking device on the escaped xenomorph had been cut off, as if with a blade. There were trace amounts of pheromones in other parts of the vessel, which led the xenomorph to Mortensen. But that was not all. The kennel door of the xenomorph was opened by the station, which made Mortensen's death a deliberate murder. Crespi asks McGinnis to unscramble the station's code and track who exactly ordered Mortensen's murder. But unfortunately for her, Church was closely listening to her conversation with Crespi. 34 and counting. Mortensen's corpse was packed in a body bag, ready to be thrown into the endless void of space. Interestingly enough, Dr. Church gave a not-so-touching eulogy for Mortensen, in which he described how he and Mortensen were so different and yet they had certain similarities, such as the strange ignorance of childhood, the difficulties of young manhood, and the sacred aching that came with first love. Once he finished, he ordered his men to take the body to the discharge bay, but Admiral Thaves interjected and reminded him that Mortensen had signed an organ donor release. Apparently, Thaves believed that this would be the way Mortensen could finally be put to some use, but Dr. Church respectfully refused and reiterated that he wished to give Mortensen a space burial with full military honors. Thaves was not happy about it, but he agreed with Church nonetheless. Church knew that Crespi had had a long day and advised him to take the day off, so Crespi left, and Lieutenant McGinnis followed him. But Church knew what was cooking between the two of them. McGinnis tells Crespi that she discovered some disturbing things about the ship and the things that happened on it, but before she could reveal all of that, she had to reveal her identity to Crespi. Apparently, she was the fiancée of David Lennox, the man whom Crespi had replaced. Lennox and Church had been research partners for several years, and he'd been trying to get a transfer order, but never succeeded. One day, McGinnis was shocked to hear that Lennox was dead. But that's not all. Her apartment was burglarized and even love letters were taken. She was now sure that something fishy was going around on Inominata, so she volunteered herself to serve on the ship. Crespi reminds her how supremely stupid her plan of coming down on a fact-finding mission was. But McGinnis reminds him that she did in fact do her job and had retrieved information. McGinnis tells him that she could not trace the station order that released the xenomorph, which killed Mortensen. Also, the medical records of all the crew members had been altered for some strange reason. But the most shocking part was that at least 34 people died on Inominata in the last 3 years. That's 11 deaths per year. But Crespi curiously pointed out that only one ship came to Inominata every year. So, where were the replacements for the dead coming from? McGinnis then reveals that every year, 3 unscheduled ships arrive at the Inominata, something that's been going on for the past 5 years. Clearly, whatever was going on had the support of people from higher up. McGinnis goes about her fact-finding and Crespi goes to the gym, but soon he hears a commotion outside. Rushing out of the gym, what Crespi saw horrified every last strand of his hair and each bone. Dr. Church was taking a stroll across the vessel's corridors with a xenomorph. He had named this xenomorph Trixie and was trying to show a horrified group of personnel that xenomorphs could be docile. Crespi was not amused, and he threatened Dr. Church of arrest on charges charges such as improper handling of contraband life forms, bioterrorism, conduct unbecoming to an officer, and even criminal insanity. Dr. Church realized that he had crossed the line and asked one of his juniors to prepare the holding cell for the pet xenomorph. Crespi then left for his quarters, but he was awakened by Dr. Church, who asked him if he wanted to see the natural death of a xenomorph firsthand. When Crespi asked Church why the xenomorph was dying, the doctor gave a list of several possible reasons, but the conclusion was that xenomorphs did not breed well in captivity. Strangely enough, this is pretty much what happens to dragons in the Game of Thrones universe. It seems that Dr. Church has started to respect these soulless creatures, the apex killing machine of the universe that lived to kill and killed to live. After receiving the confirmation of the xenomorph's passing, Crespi orders the carcass to be brought to the lab for dissection. At the lab, Church begins dissecting the creature and begins with what looks like the brain. Interestingly, he makes a number of intelligent remarks and conclusions about the functioning of a xenomorph. From the several years of looking inside the heads of xenomorphs, Church had become something of an expert on the subject. The surface of the head was lined with compound cells of fullerite-encased herlantium. The internal structure was composed of solid neurons in two binary fans, which enabled the creature to receive brain waves and to assess another animal's characteristic by seeing the animal's body. And strong fields of electromagnetic waves rendered the creature the xenomorph version of a brain freeze. All of this genuinely fascinated Crespi, who believed that Church was a scientific genius whose research was going to transform science. He returned to his quarters, where McGinnis confronted him about his false belief. She revealed that a third of the vessel's power was being consumed by a zero-gravity lab where Church was cooking something sinister, something big. After much ado, McGinnis managed to convince Crespi to find this ghost facility. However, there was a catch. The facility had 3 double-code single-access doors installed, and the code slate had to be stolen from Church's quarters. The bioscan would not allow a lieutenant like McGinnis in, but Crespi could enter because he was a superior officer, a colonel, doctor. Crespi manages to get his hands on the code slate, but something catches his attention as he's about to leave. Turning around, he realizes that he was not alone in there. He was, in fact, with a xenomorph, which attacked him. He would have become the xenomorph's lunch had it not been for the open generator control panel. Crespi comes to McGinnis with the slate, but he's fuming with anger. He mistakenly believed that it was a setup by McGinnis, who wanted to kill Crespi for some damned reason. This was the second time Crespi doubted his only partner on the entire vessel. Nevertheless, McGinnis manages to convince Crespi to give her one more chance. The two of them reach the zero-gravity K-lab where the ghost facility was supposed to be. After McGinnis opens the locked doors, what they find inside shocks and horrifies them. There were multiple mutated human bodies that Church had been working on. The 34 dead people had been used for human experiments by Church. Not only do they find Mortensen, but also what remained of David Lennox, McGinnis's fiancé and Crespi's predecessor. A horrific past. The third issue begins on a rather grim note as McGinnis realizes that her fiancé was still alive, even if he had lost his mind. Neither Crespi nor McGinnis is happy to see the man, and McGinnis hurls herself at him in a bid to attack and probably kill him. But something strange happened at that moment. Dr. Church, a frail 52-year-old man, is able to grab this healthy woman with just one hand and lift her up in the air. Not only was he calm and composed as ever, but lifting McGinnis up didn't seem to make him uncomfortable. Crespi pointed a gun at Church's face, and somehow the old doctor managed to disarm Crespi with superhuman speed. Crespi asks if he was a synthetic, but Church says, "No, not a synth. Aside from several implants, I am quite human." Both McGinnis and Crespi were clueless as to what was going on, and to defeat an enemy this strong, they had to know just how powerful he was and what his weaknesses were. Fortunately for them, Church himself started telling his backstory, apparently because it was important if they wished to understand his diabolic research. He began 32 years from the present, when he was a young man of 20. His parents were terraformers, and Paul Church was born to them in space. It was not until he was 6 that he landed his foot on Earth for the first time. His early life was spent on ships and on Genesis camps, and most of it he spent on a ship named Incunabulum. Despite living a fairly unnatural life, he did not complain, because his parents were close to him and the entire crew was like family. Apart from him and his parents, there were 3 men named Tyler, Hewitt, and Johansson. Also, there was a female synth named Judith, whose only purpose was to keep the men happy. But then, she was programmed as a botanist. Later, the crew was joined by the scientist couple Quentin and Louise Clark and their daughter Rebecca. The Clarks were on the ship because they were being transported to RLW 1289. Church has always wanted to become a scientist, and he was so good that at a very young age, he received a grant from the government which allowed him to conduct his research on immunization. According to Church, life was good. Before landing on RLW 1289, they had to make a pit stop at a moon that his parents had terraformed some 15 years ago. It was a routine data-gathering operation, and a time box was to be collected. So, of course, there was no reason to anticipate any troubles, but they were all in for a few nasty surprises. The first one was the discovery of another spaceship. General travel to the moon was restricted and off-limits, so the crew thought it must belong to pirates and smugglers. Soon, the data that they wanted was retrieved, and the crew planned to leave, but before they could do that, they saw something else, something more sinister that they had heard about only in stories of other spacefarers. The crew found itself facing xenomorphs, and they knew at that moment that their little weapons would be useless against these creatures that are almost always the source of a brutal, bloody, and terrifying death. But the xenomorphs did not kill the crew, and instead they were brought to the hive. As they got closer to the hive, a strong and stomach-churning smell filled the environment. But as the xenomorphs brought the men and women inside, this smell proved to be something beyond stench and beyond foul. Church describes that it was an incomprehensibly loathsome miasma that assaulted one's soul through their lungs. Anyway, they were next brought inside a chamber and dumped on the ground. The xenomorphs were showcasing an unusual set of behaviors. They started by sniffing and licking the humans, as if trying to inspect something or understand more about them. The xenomorphs grabbed Rebecca and started fighting over her. Of course, it didn't end well for the young girl, who was torn into pieces like she was some paper bag. The synthetic Judith was programmed to defend humans whenever the need befell, and she did exactly that, only to be torn into pieces. Out of all the humans, only Taylor managed to put up a meaningful defense. He took 2 of the xenomorphs out with a grenade, but gave his life in the process. The xenomorphs became more cautious after this and started to act quickly. The humans were separated from each other, and Church was taken to the bowel of the hive. It was here that Church found the crew of the other ship on the moon. Their hanging bodies were bloated and mutilated, but strangely, some of them were still breathing. Church was hung onto a wall with spider web-like mucus, and was left there to contemplate his fate. Church guesses that he spent probably around 40 or 50 hours in that state, and all this while, his eyes and nose were scoured by the gases and the hideous stench, while his ears were filled by the sounds of distant sobbing, screaming, and begging. It was so bad for Church that when the creatures returned, he hoped and prayed that they'd come to finish him off. But strangely enough, they'd come to feed him, which was stopped when the xenomorphs heard a scream. The man was Quentin Clark, and something had been done to him, but he didn't stop screaming even when he was pushed into a pool of green slime which was filled with tadpole-like creatures. Quentin was then taken to the wall like the others, but he kept on screaming until he shredded his own vocal cords. As for Church, he wanted to die. He tried to swallow his tongue, but gave up the idea. After this, Quentin retreated into a realm of pure delusion. While he was still in this state, he was removed from the wall. The xenomorphs were taking him somewhere, but he'd given up. Church was simply waiting for his end. Ultimately, he was brought to the breeding pen, but here, the sobbing and sucking sound coming from the vicinity brought him back to reality. He was thinking rationally and clearly once again. Church couldn't believe his eyes when he saw what remained of Louise Clark. She was alive, but was impossibly gravid with a huge and monstrously swollen belly. Church wanted to do something to help the woman, but he knew all of his attempts would be in vain. In the end, the woman delivered several small xenomorph babies, but the babies didn't survive for even an hour. Clearly, something was wrong with these xenomorphs, because that's not how they breed, right? They go from overmorphs to facehuggers to chest bursters. Church knew that these xenomorphs were more vulnerable than what he had heard in the stories, and a new resolve had taken birth inside of him. And although he was continuously transported from one location to another, he kept his eyes and ears open to gain information that could help him destroy the hive. He was taken to the pool of the green liquid, but before they could force him to drink it, he himself drank it. He understood that if he could anticipate their actions and comply, he would be spared the torture. Furthermore, whatever the xenomorphs did, he copied them. For instance, he fed on one of the mutating captives. It wasn't before long that the xenomorphs stopped keeping a strict vigil on him, and he was free to gather as much information as he could. He managed to take samples and perform crude experiments to discover that the xenomorphs had developed a medicine of sorts against a black mold that was destroying them. He immediately used his research to destroy the medicine and unleashed a crude version of the bioweapon on the xenomorphs. His belief that xenomorphs were indomitable and unkillable proved wrong as he continued to fool and poison them. He started to believe that these creatures were rather vulnerable, analyzable, and conquerable, but he'd been so obsessed that he stopped wondering about how it would all end. Church was caught and taken to a place where a large sloping cradle had been built up out of alien secretions, and inside it there was a human figure. To his shock, it was his dear mother. She'd been mutilated beyond repair, but something far worse was expected of Church. He was expected to mate with his own mother. and he did the only thing he could for her at that point in time. He killed her with his own bare hands. After that, the xenomorphs resorted to impregnating Dr. Church with a facehugger, and the creature stuck something down his trachea. When Crespi asked Church how he managed to survive, Dr. Church says that he did not. And that's where issue 3 ends. A terrific cliffhanger, we must say. The value of human life. When Church finally regained consciousness after the impregnation, his resolve to survive had been broken, and though he knew he would soon die, he wanted to die outside of the hive, under the sun, in fresh air. So he began his quest to find a way out of the hive, and he did find one. He passed by the smuggler ship and reached his own. First, he washed himself up and tended to the several wounds he had. Next, he scanned his body to learn about the alien larva growing inside of him. To his surprise, the larva was dead inside his body, but it was rotting, and he had to remove it immediately. He gathered whatever equipment he could and performed surgery on himself. The surgery lasted for 7 hours, but was ultimately successful. He then sent a distress signal, and help arrived a month later. When he was debriefed, he learned that the smugglers were aspiring bug farmers, and they were responsible for the hive on the moon. The company considered his experience invaluable and gave compensation for the ordeal. He was granted a full biomechanical makeover, and he's been studying xenomorphs ever since. Church then tells Crespi that McGinnis had been lying about her relationship with Lennox all along, and that she was a spy. Crespi falls for this once again, and McGinnis realizes that she has to flee. Church sends Crespi after her, and the two of them find themselves in the pit where Church kept his xenomorph named Trixie. But Church gives them yet another opportunity to live and says that if they manage to escape from the labyrinth they were in, they might be allowed to live. The two of them make a run for their lives, but xenomorphs pursue them. In the chase, Crespi gets fatally wounded by a xenomorph, but he learns that Church's experiments had weakened the beasts. And yet he could not escape his imminent death and didn't want to be impregnated by xenomorphs either. So he asks McGinnis to mercy kill him, a request that she grants unwillingly. McGinnis escaped Crespi's fate and managed to find Church. She slammed his nose against a railing and broke it before throwing Church into the xenomorph pit. Trixie was waiting for Church there, and would have killed him had it not been for the guards who immobilized the creature. Church was then taken to the hospital, where Admiral Thaves visits him and tells him that McGinnis had been framed for Crespi's murder and that the Marines had picked her up the previous week. It turns out that Church's interactions with Crespi and McGinnis had taken a toll on him, and he finally doubted the ethics of his research. He was clearly feeling remorse, but the man was crazy. Admiral Thaves assures him that his research has saved countless lives and that it should be continued. Later, Church visits the mutated body of Crespi in a large holding tank and tells him, "I hope you know, Tony, none of this is personal." Interestingly, the comics have not yet killed him, but we're not sure if this story arc will be carried forward by Disney, who now owns the rights to the Aliens and Predator universes. Do you think this guy should be revived? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, and be safe. Thanks everyone.